Welcome to the COPOut Podcast. I'm Dana Fisher, the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity at American University. This is an opportunity to have apocalyptically optimistic climate conversations, and there's lots to talk about today. And I am so happy and privileged to be joined by these amazing women who do such amazing work. And I just thought we would start. So just as a wrap up here, COP is winding down. Literally, the blue zone set on fire yesterday. Perhaps a sign from the gods, perhaps. And then today, the draft text for the final text coming out of COP was released, which made no mention to fossil fuel phase out, ignored completely the 80 some countries that were actually pushing for a fossil fuel phase out. So we have lots to talk about. To begin, what I thought maybe would be good to do is for you each to take a moment to introduce yourselves. You're both climate communicators in really different ways, and you have really different backgrounds. So maybe talk a little bit about how you came to do the kind of climate communication you do, just as a start. And of course, we'll get into COP, we'll get into climate change and the mess we're in. But, just a little background first. Katharine, you want to start?
Sure. Yes, I love that you're talking to Amy and I both because we both came from totally different directions. So I am a climate scientist, and I actually started my career in astrophysics, which is a fascinating field to be in if there's no other dumpster fires going on in the world. And so for me, my first inflection point was when I took a class on climate change as a breadth requirement. And that was where I learned that climate change I already knew it was real, but I didn't realize it was so urgent. I didn't realize it was affecting our lives so personally, and I didn't realize it was so unfair in that it is disproportionately affecting the people who've done the least to cause the problem in the first place, whether it's the fact that the richest 1% in the world today produce double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50%, or whether it's the fact that a child born today will experience so many disasters over their lifetime as a result of the choices that our generation and previous generations made that they weren't part of in the first place. So for me, my first inflection point was just realizing I need to do something about this. And I have a scientific skill set, so I will become a climate scientist. It turns out the same physics and astronomy I was learning is just what you need to do climate modeling because, it's the Earth's atmosphere, nonlinear fluid dynamics, radiative transfer. So that was my first inflection point. And then a number of years later, after becoming a climate scientist, after getting married to a fellow academic who, when you're an academic, the dream is that you have positions in the same place. And so he was at one place, I was at a different place, and then he got offered a position in Texas. And he sort of said, okay, well, if you give my spouse a position, we'll both come. And we both thought, oh, there's no chance of that. Well, they did. So that's how I ended up in Texas. And then within just a couple of months of ending up in Texas, and I was already doing research that was intentionally very policy relevant because I wanted to inform good policy decisions on climate. Within a few months of arriving in Texas, it turns out I was the first climate scientist at the university. I was the only climate scientist within literally a 500-mile radius. I plotted it out. And so I started to get invitations to speak to community groups who were, confused about climate change, weren't sure what to think, had heard a lot on both sides. And they're like, oh, well, here's a climate scientist. Let's ask her. And so that experience really taught me, and I still do almost 100 talks a year these days, most of them virtual. Those experiences taught me that having conversations about not just what I think is the head, which is the facts, the data, the ice sheets, the polar bears, but making the heart connection. My family, my home, the places I love, the people and the things I love is so important. And that in itself isn't even enough. We also need to make the heart to hand connection. Because today, in 2025, most people are worried about climate change, but most people feel there's nothing they can do about it. So they do nothing, and they're actually starting to dissociate from the issue as a defense mechanism as the situation gets worse. So how do we connect the head to the heart to the hands? Well, the first and easiest way to do it is through communicating. Not like lining up all the IPCC reports and just whacking people upside the head with them, but rather starting the conversation with what people care about themselves And I've started conversations based on, the fact that we're both parents, or we both live in the same place, or we both enjoy chocolate and that's being affected by climate change. Or I've even had conversations that we started over the fact that we both knit. And then connecting that to hands, what we can do. So that is what led me to my communication journey, because I started to realize that the biggest barrier between where we are today and that better future that we all need is, in addressing the climate crisis, is understanding what we can do about it and getting people to actually be active about doing it. And that's not going to be answered by more scientific journal articles. That's going to be answered by having conversations.
Thank you. That's really great. Sorry, my computer was being annoying for a second. Amy, why don't you give us your journey?
Oh my gosh. Well, I as so many people do, the first thing I ever did remotely related to climate was just because I needed to pay the rent, and it was due in 2 weeks. And I had a friend who was an engineer at an engineering firm. And he was like, well, we have this really boring copywriting job that needs to be done next week, where we need someone to write case studies about some of our projects. And I was like, okay, fine, I'm in, thank you. And I did. And one of them was a project they had done for Shell, where they'd been asked to re-engineer offshore oil platforms to deal with sea level rise. And this was like a project that they had done in the 90s. And I was like, that's interesting, because I feel like Shell wasn't even really acknowledging climate change in the 90s. And so I looked into it, and I was freelancing at the time. So I was like, this is an interesting story. I'm going to pitch it to an environmental magazine. And I did. And then they hired me to do some other stuff. And I sort of just became obsessed with this power structure. So totally not the science side of things. I was like, that's unfair. These big, powerful companies had this information, and they were preparing their own industry to deal with this issue. And at the same time, they were telling everybody else not to worry about it. And how did that happen? And then I just sort of went from there into I very obsessively researched climate denial. And then there again was this is a dumb strategy. Why did it work so well? So I got obsessed with PR and the whole I don't know, the way that the fossil fuel industry, way before climate change, really set in place some fundamental ideas about how the environment works and what is nature and how the economy works and all of those kinds of things. And I have just kind of been down that same rabbit hole ever since. And at a certain point, when the Exxon New story came out, and reporters at Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times and Columbia Journalism School published on all of these documents that came from inside Exxon, where the scientists had been trying to warn executives about what their product could do and, how things might change in the decades to come. I felt like I wanted to hear from those scientists themselves. So, and I thought that I was just man, more people who don't already care about climate need to hear this story. So I went out to talk to those guys and spent a lot of time hanging out with long retired scientists and having them read documents to me and tell me about, their science and all of that kind of stuff. And that got me obsessed with podcasting. So now I have a podcast that I still do reporting, and I'm still just obsessed with this hijacking of the information ecosystem and policymaking mechanisms by this one very powerful industry and a lot of their friends. So yeah.
They're famous and fancy friends. Exactly. I mean, it's funny. So
Yeah.
I never really thought about it. I mean, so I came to climate just because when I was doing my PhD, I needed a case study that I could study internationally and also at the national level. And it was when the Kyoto Protocol was being written and finalized.
It's so interesting.
And it was a perfect case for the political questions that I was asking. So I actually came at it from the politics. And I had this grant in Japan, and my advisor who did the Asia integrated model for the IPCC, Morita Tsuneyuki, he was like, you should do climate. And I'm like, oh, this is good idea. This is a good idea. And so it was just funny because it all started just because it was a good case study. for the kinds of stuff I was studying. And then down the rabbit hole we go. And here we are.
Yeah.
25 years later or whatever, right? More than that now.
Yeah.
So I guess
interesting.
then it is funny that we all come from very different places, but here we are. And so the question I have for you next,
and it all happened in the 90s, which is when climate change was not a politicized issue at that time. The disinformation engine was just starting to ramp up.
Yep.
The impacts, the signal was just starting to emerge from the noise at that point. But if you look for the signal, it was there. And so each of us, for different reasons, came into contact with the signal in the 90s. And that was powerful enough to basically change the entire trajectory of our careers.
Yeah.
That's
fascinating.
Yeah. Very true. I mean, I did go to meetings with the Cooler Heads Coalition, who were part of the case for my dissertation, and ended up getting kicked out of their meetings because they were definitely birthing some misinformation back then. But it was very early days, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But actually,
I interned at Exxon for my master's degree. I actually worked with their full
Did
permission.
they pay? Was it a paid internship at least? I certainly hope so.
Yes, it was paid. And we published peer-reviewed papers out of my research that were, with they have some really good scientists, obviously. Their scientists have known about this and been telling the company about this for decades. And what we were studying was related to Kyoto. We were studying how, when you're talking about reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, you have to reduce all of the gases, not just CO2. And methane is one of the ones that is really powerful, really potent. It's responsible for somewhere between about 16 to 18% of long-term warming and a much greater proportion of short-term warming. And methane is
some
released.
People call that natural gas even.
I know. Fossil gas is what we now call it.
Yeah.
Massive amounts of it are released during the extraction of coal, oil, and leaking from gas. So that is a very important research area, but it rapidly became obvious. And even then, what we were saying back in the 90s was true with Kyoto, and it's much more true today. There's no one thing that if we just did this one thing, it would fix it. It was very obvious even then that reducing methane was something that we could do super fast to really get a handle on this issue while we were working on the longer term CO2 reductions. And if we had done that back in the 1990s, we would be in a much better spot than we are today.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, that actually, what I was going to ask you both as a follow-up question is just how you ended up communicating about this stuff specifically within the policy world, or like communicating to politicians, communicating about politicians, that kind of policy nexus. I know, Amy, you want to go?
I mean,
if it's a stumper, we don't have to go there. It's just,
no, it's okay. The thing, I mean, I would say like that the main input that we have had on policy is documents. It's like giving documents to Senate investigators or to chiefs of staff who are looking at, particular issues. Or like someone will contact me and be like, do you know if there's any evidence of, this PR firm doing anything in this thing, blah, blah, blah. And I'll send them. Uh-oh, I'm hearing an echo. No,
you sound fine from here.
Okay, great. So yeah, that's the main thing for me. And then I know I have like met some policymakers who say that they have either like listened to the podcast or read stuff and shared it with other people and things like that. But I think in terms of like actually communicating things that are useful to policymakers, it's more that like we go find documents, or people will
communicate about policymaking to the public, which then also has that boomerang effect in terms of then changing potentially public opinion or political pressure, right?
Yes, that's true. That's true.
A really important role.
I was going to say too that we do often like for whatever reason, I don't know how this still happens, but not infrequently I will be interviewing someone who is like an operative of some kind, and they will just like very explicitly say what they're trying to do in terms of like hijacking policy too. Which I'm like, wow, great. Thank you for making my job easy.
That's a lot of doing deep research there, huh? It's just like, okay.
Yeah.
Silver platter. Fill it up.
Yeah. In fact, actually, I mean, even at this, I was at the COP, and there were several of these like side events that different industry groups were having where they were just, I guess they just thought they were talking amongst themselves and were saying a lot of the quiet parts were getting said out loud.
Why not travel all the way to Brazil to have a private meeting? Yeah, exactly. Why not?
With the journalist.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was like, this is open to the press, you guys. Like, I don't know.
It's a measure, I think, of their confidence. When people are very confident that they're
Yes.
going to win, they don't care. And that's
Yeah.
really what we're seeing.
Yeah,
Well,
totally.
I love this question that you asked, because that's actually the very first thing that I wanted to do when I decided to switch from astrophysics to climate science. Is I wanted to make sure I was doing policy relevant research, because I'm a huge believer in informed decision making. I know that our human brains typically do not make rational decisions, but I do hope that, and I know there is significant evidence that when we make collective decisions with many more people and interests at the table, we have a tendency to make better decisions. And those decisions, if they're informed by science and by information, can improve. And so when I went to look for an advisor, because I was finishing up my undergrad degree and going on to graduate school, I specifically looked for an advisor who did policy relevant research. And I found this wonderful man who's like my academic father. I still talk to him on a regular basis. His name is Don Webbles. He's at the University of Illinois. And he had done his initial research on developing metrics to measure the ozone depleting substances so that you could compare how much worse or better different ones were. And he worked with the FAA and with DuPont and with the EPA to actually put the Montreal Protocol limiting ozone depleting substances into effect. And he actually tested all these new chemicals that the organizations were coming up with to replace the chemicals we used to use in our spray cans and even our Nike Air shoes, of all things, and our air conditioners and our fridges, to figure out better ones. And he had just turned his attention to looking at comparing different greenhouse gases too. And so I immediately figured I want to work with this person who's doing policy relevant research. Some work I did for my master's degree, which was literally looking at how much more affordable it would be for the US to meet its Kyoto targets if it included all the greenhouse gases, not just carbon. And that work was actually presented to Congress in part of the debates over whether the US should be a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. So at that point, I was like,
was that as part of the Byrd-Hagel resolution when they were debating that? Is that when it was, Katharine? I'm just curious.
Goodness, I actually don't know. That's a good question. I remember the date when it was, but I don't remember what part of the resolution it was. But it was definitely part of it. And so at that point, I was like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. This is exactly what I want to do. Well, then, as you know, all efforts to pass mitigation legislation in the US just sort of went like this. And at the same time, I ended up getting pulled into, after my master's and before my PhD, I ended up getting pulled into a regional climate assessment. And that was where I learned that people who were making decisions on how to protect nature and people from climate change were working with future information that was years and even decades out of date. It was the equivalent to me trying to drive down the street without my glasses. And my glasses are very thick. Like, I would just see sort of a hazy outline. And if I saw a light, I don't think I'd even know if it was a stoplight or not. So that was sort of the way that people were 20, 30 years ago working with climate information. And so that's what made me decide to sort of refocus my trajectory to look at climate impacts. And especially back then, climate impacts were being qualified as the middle of the road scenario. This is what's going to happen no matter what. Well, that is a completely disempowering perspective, because if it's going to happen no matter what, then, who cares? We'll just adapt. But what I knew that our choices made a difference. And now today we know that our choices make the biggest difference in the future. And so I thought, well, what if not only we generated high resolution information. So if you're working, for example, in the Midwest US, you don't have like one grid cell covering the whole US. You actually have information for Chicago versus Milwaukee versus Minneapolis versus the other sides of the lake in Michigan, because the climate is very different in all those places. What if you not only had very granular information, but you also had information on what's going to happen depending on the choices we make? So what's going to happen for a lower versus a higher scenario? So I said this to the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Ecological Society of America that were sponsoring this Great Lakes assessment that I was working on. And they said, well, it's too late to do it now, but what if we do another one for California, which is one of the world's biggest economies, and we look at higher versus lower emissions there? Would you like to be in charge of getting that information for us? And so I, being very young and naive, said, yes, of course, I would love to do that. And then I realized that at that point, the global climate models had not even run the higher scenarios. Because physical climate scientists work with physical uncertainty, and physical uncertainty is what we call Gaussian, or a normal distribution, which means it looks like this, which means that the middle is more likely to be accurate than the tails. So physical scientists had applied the same principle to future scenarios, and they had said, oh, well, we'll just run the middle scenarios because we don't have infinite computer time, and the middle scenarios are most likely. But human behavior is not Gaussian. Human behavior is completely unpredictable. If anything, it might be like, well, we're heading for this scenario, and then, oh, shit, look how bad it is. We will quickly head for this scenario. So we didn't even have the global climate model simulations to look at the higher scenarios, except for in the UK. They were the only ones who'd done it. So I had to go cap in hand, and this is me, in the 90s as a graduate student, go cap in hand to some of the biggest modeling organizations in the US, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, and ask them out of the goodness of their heart if they would be willing to run the higher scenarios. Huh. And they did. And so for California in 2003, we published the first impact study in all of North America and one of the very first in the entire world that actually quantified the difference between if we address climate change at scale versus if we don't, what will be the impacts on your water supply, your snowpack, your wine grapes, your Central Valley crop harvests, the wildfire risk. We actually quantified the impact of human decisions. And 2 years later, the governor of California, actually 1.5 years later, the governor of California, who at that time was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who of course is also a Republican, signed the first executive order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions of any state in the US. And as he signed it, he had our California authors standing in a semicircle behind him, and they cited our study as evidence of why they had to reduce emissions.
That's political connection there. That's so interesting. I mean, it's funny because my supervisor in my PhD actually was famous for saying that when we deal with a lot of environmental problems, it's the tail that wags the distribution. He loved to say that because it really is. And he was famous for doing the work on disproportionality, which was all about how these extreme actors, the extreme emitters, were the ones that basically are driving the entire distribution in a lot of ways.
Which is just what we see happening with COP today.
Exactly, right. And now it's like he unfortunately passed away a number of years ago, but I'm sure that he is rolling in his grave and he's like, why didn't anybody read that work that I published so many years ago? But I mean, that's why being a climate communicator is so important, because the information has to get out there. But I mean, that brings us to my question about COP, right? So we have this climate regime that basically, all of the secrets are out in the open. Like back when I used to go to the climate negotiations, instead of sitting at home talking to amazing people like you guys, I used to go there and we would sit at coffee and we would whisper like, oh, that person's actually with, they're funded by Exxon, or they have connections to fossil fuel industry in this way, but they all came undercover. Nobody showed up and was like, I'm here, I'm going to just stop everything, right? And I'm just so I can't believe where we are today, but I want to know kind of impressions on where we are based on what we've seen. I mean, Amy, you were just there. Give us some on the ground, perspective.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, like Katharine was saying, they no longer feel any compulsion to pretend that they're not there to, fart in church. But it's wild to me. Actually, what was so interesting to me was how few of the people who were, with either civil society groups or universities or whatever that to try to encourage climate action knew like how many fossil fuel lobbyists were there, or how many carbon capture lobbyists were there, or how many big ag lobbyists. Like it was like a surprise to them. And I'm like, wow, like to me, it's like, yes, of course, this thing is inundated by industry lobbyists.
Last year it was crazy. It just continues to
yeah.
grow.
And I don't know, the extent to which, even if you were to get rid of all of the lobbyists, so many of the negotiators in the room are doing the bidding of the industry, either from, oil states like Saudi Arabia, or even Norway's entire booth was like Equinor employees,
Well, Amy,
yeah.
I read, and I'm curious, is this something that you saw, that Brazil was requiring all attendees to actually disclose who funded them. So though at this time, like the fossil fuel attendees, like previous hosts were petrostates. Brazil is not a petrostate, although it certainly has a lot of natural gas resources. But I heard that the fossil fuel attendees outnumber all delegations except for Brazil. They're there even though they're required to actually disclose their funding. How did you see that in play?
Yeah, I mean, well, the thing is like theoretically they have to disclose, and theoretically like lobbyists are supposed to badge appropriately and whatever. But if they are like smuggled in through a country's delegation, then like that goes out the window. Or if they are, maybe they're at a university, but most of their research is funded by the fossil fuel industry, then like they're just wearing their university's tag. Or the one that we've looked at a lot is IPICA. God, I can never remember what the acronym stands for because they changed it to just IPICA a few years ago. But it's the International Petroleum Industry Environmental Conservation Association, which is this like weird little entity that was created by the UN as part of UNEP in the 70s. And it was created for the sole purpose of, at the time, getting the industry together to coordinate on global environmental issues, which was mostly oil spills in that moment. But it's very clear in the forming documents of that organization that the industry saw this as like the way that they were going to have a window into the UN processes and make sure that industry's perspective was clear. That was 1973. So they've been there the whole time, like what is it? Oh my God. I can't think of the expression coming from inside the house, but like anyway, it's
legacy.
Yes, it's just
the
like
call is coming from inside the
call
house.
is coming from inside the house. Exactly.
They're releasing a new Scream movie. I saw a preview for it in a movie theater, so
Yes,
the call is coming from inside the house. Yeah.
So they're there, so IPICA started in the 70s, part of UNEP. Then in the late 90s, they spun off to be their own nonprofit, but they are still an official observer at COP and the IPCC. They're officially listed as a non-lobbying organization, even though their entire existence is to provide cover for industry. So all the industry guys show up there with IPICA badges, and nobody knows what that is. And yeah. So they're able to go to, all of like the daily coordination meetings between different observer groups. They can go into the negotiating rooms. They can, they can hang out in the hallway and wait for delegates to come out and talk to them. Like there's absolutely nothing stopping them from influencing things. It's like we see the effect of that every year. Just this morning, the new draft text came out, and not only has they stripped fossil fuel phase out from it, but they've added overshoot twice. So like,
I didn't know about that.
Yeah. And but they've also given a nod to information integrity in the same text. And I'm like, how? Like, how are these two things in the same space? So
I'm going to plug episode 4, which just came out this morning, where I spoke with Freddie Otto and David Ho, who had a whole we had a part of our conversation was all about the science behind overshoot and to the degree to which we know if overshoot will actually work and if we could actually, if it will actually be feasible. But it's, of course, now the policymakers are like, or not, I don't know who it is, like the industry connected policymakers are putting it into text.
Yeah.
And they're basically putting in like stuff that has no scientific evidence that it'll actually work.
And
So I
they're
think it's
adding
worth
it.
just pointing that.
I mean, they're a month before COP. There was a IPCC meeting in Lima where they are debating how much, like, which types of CDR to add, carbon dioxide removal, to add to the next IPCC assessment. They're going to have a whole chapter on carbon capture and storage. One researcher I talked to described it as like these sort of science fiction ideas escaping the model and getting into into negotiating text and policy. And it's frightening. I was like lurking in a lot of these like weird little industry side groups to kind of see what they were talking about. And there were a lot focused on carbon dioxide removal. And in one of them, they talked about carbon dioxide removal in Article 6, which is like the part of the Paris Agreement that's set up, is trying to like tighten up and better regulate carbon markets. And there were ongoing debates about whether to include carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal under that. And they have now decided to. And they thought that, they had at least gotten this like science-based target for permanence of 100 years, that like you have to show that this carbon is going to stay put for 100 years. And a bunch of people showed up at this year's COP arguing to make it 30 years. And so there was but there was a scientist in one of these panels who said, obviously from an environmental perspective and a climate perspective, afforestation and reforestation are the preferred approaches to carbon storage and carbon removal, but the markets don't like them.
Yeah, so this is
yeah.
This is
So
a challenging issue because this is something I run into all the time. There's all of these, when it comes to climate solutions, there's no silver bullet. But there's a lot of silver buckshot. So immediately, if anybody pitches anything as a silver bullet, your radar should go up. That's not the case. But all of these different solutions, we need as many solutions as we can. So I think of climate solutions as, if you think of the atmosphere as a swimming pool, and the level of water in the pool is like the level of carbon in the atmosphere. And 200 years ago, we stuck a giant hose in the pool. We turn the hose up every year. So we have to turn the hose off, but we can also make the drain bigger. And then we also have to learn how to swim because our toes don't touch the ground now for most of the pool. So we need all these solutions, and none of these solutions are inherently wrong or evil in and of themselves. And I often see a lot of discussion sort of pitching a given solution as evil or wrong. It's how they're used or misused that make the difference. So, there's people, I talk to a lot of people all across the spectrum, and there's people, doing direct air capture and even planning how we could do carbon capture and sequestration or things like that, who are fully cognizant of the fact that we're talking about the last few drops down the drain at this point, or the last few drops in the hose. And they're right. The science says every bit of warming matters. Every drop matters. So if you develop a technology that applied at the appropriate time can take one more drop out, that's great. But what's happening is bad actors, Amy, and this is exactly what you know all about. Bad actors are taking these solutions. They're taking everything from the voluntary carbon market with nature to geologic storage to, you name it. And they're using it as a fig leaf to say, oh, I don't have to do anything about it because, and, I've even heard companies say, we'll increase our extraction of fossil fuels because we'll just do, carbon capture and storage. I'm like, excuse me. We don't actually have enough geologic storage areas in the entire world to actually cover just the carbon that you would be taking out. So there's a problem because I feel like so much of the discussion is so like, it's very like good and evil. And if you espouse the solution, you're evil. And if you don't, you're good. A lot of sort of almost religious puritanism in it. But the reality is it's what we do with these solutions and how we use them or misuse them. That's really the key discussion that I feel like is often not happening in the decision-making and policy and even the public circles, like on Blue Sky or something like that.
Totally. Oh, sorry.
We keep cutting you off, Dana.
I'm just going to interject one little point here, and then you should go, Amy, which is just to say that I think, when we think about the toolbox of solutions, like obviously we need to encourage every and all solution possible because we're in an all hands on deck moment. But I also think there needs to be a realistic framing to the degree to which what actually can work at what scale at the moment, given the technology. And the time where we close our eyes, hold our ears and just, la, 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 while we say, no, we're just going to figure out, carbon dioxide removal and we're fine. We are way past that moment. And so I think that's where we need to make sure that everybody has to be, we have to call BS on the people who are leaning into technology that can't scale the way they're talking about, like you were talking about, Katharine. Go ahead, Amy.
Yes.
I was just going to say that actually I spoke with one researcher who was at this AR7 meeting in Lima talking about the different technologies and stuff. And they described it really, I think, in a helpful way, which is that, like prior meetings, these technologies had always been discussed as like necessary because the climate crisis is so urgent that we want to make sure we have all of these technologies available, and discussed as like being particularly useful for hard to abate industries and things like that. And that this was the first meeting they had attended where some people were very openly describing it as like, we need to be able to remove emissions here so that we can continue emitting them there. And it was like, no, that's not the way. Yeah.
So I want to ask you the tough question, or one of the tough questions, which is, so is this this institutional system that is the COP, which is the climate regime, which has really become captured by fossil fuel interests and is, platforming fossil fuel interests and their perspectives quite, clearly within the meetings. I mean, more and more. Like, I think it's worse this year than it was last year, than it was the year before. And we weren't even a petrostate this year, right? So the question is, can we salvage the regime? Is it fixable? Or is there another way that we should be thinking about addressing the climate crisis at this point? Solve the world. Fix it.
My answer is yes to both.
Yeah. Same.
Yes,
I have the same answer.
Yes, and
yes.
me?
Yes.
You guys are going to yes and me. I should have known. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is incredible value just to bringing everybody together, to look each other in the faces. When you are looking into the face of a small island state who could lose their entire country due to unchecked climate change, that has a much different emotional impact than when they are a green circle on a map or an email that somebody sent you. So I think of these COP meetings as a global potluck where everybody shows up and publicly puts what they're bringing on the table. And it is very obvious who made the apple pie by hand and who dragged a frozen chicken nugget out of the back of the freezer that's been there for years, and also who doesn't even show up to the potluck dinner. So there is tremendous value in that, but COP is way, way overdue for a major reform. It has just, the negotiations are one thing. Everybody else who's not a negotiator getting together is a totally different thing. In fact, I know they're splitting it between Turkey and Australia next year. In my opinion, I would send the negotiators to one of the place and I would send the rest of the circus to the other place. That's what I would do, because they're really two separate things. And then also, too, really getting a handle on the fossil fuel industry being the largest delegation there. That just isn't right. But then I would say, too, the idea that only countries getting together to come to decisions that must be unanimous and expecting that to somehow fix the whole crisis, it's not just naive, it's delusional. Anybody who thought this would fix the whole crisis has no idea on how anything works. I mean, I'm not even the political scientist, right? So it's never been enough. And that's why even in Paris, the mayor of Paris was holding their own sort of COP for all the mayors, because a lot of cities these days are bigger than our countries. And we need to have all other organizations brought in, whether it's universities, whether it's businesses, whether it's organizations or even religious traditions, all of those have to come in. And, one of the recent announcements just today is that the more and more countries and organizations are signing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, that is the brainchild of Zipporah Berman. And so Colombia and the Netherlands are going to hold a non-proliferation treaty meeting, which I think will be a tremendous step forward in a different direction. So that's why my answer is yes, yes. We need to reform the COP process, but we also need more.
Yeah.
Amy?
I was going to mention that Columbia meeting too. I think it's going to be really interesting. And
Yeah,
I would
definitely.
just say too that like, for whatever reason, I mean, I think we all know the big systemic reasons, but like, I don't think Colombia got anywhere near enough attention for the way it showed up at this COP, which was like the only country where the inside people and the outside people were absolutely on the same page. Like, they're just like very clear fossil fuel phase out, just transition, and like really were the ones pushing that message very consistently. And I think that like, it actually kind of broke through in some ways that didn't get picked up like in the media or in any of the big conversations. And I think that like actually them getting the Netherlands on board for this
I was going to ask you if you have
meeting
insights on how you,
is
insights
like
on the Netherlands, because that was one
that's
of
a
my cases way back when. So
Mhm.
I'm a
that's
little
a big
surprised.
deal. Like
Yeah.
that's, you know,
That's
Shell's
Shellville.
home country. So
Yep.
like that's a really big deal. And then they also said, hey, 80 countries that signed on to fossil fuel phase out, come to our party in Colombia next year. So that's really interesting. I talked to Kumi Naidu, who's running the Non-Proliferation Treaty now, and he was saying, and Zipporah too, that like they have modeled this after the landmine decommissioning treaties, and that in that case, you know, it was only 20 countries that actually signed on to that, but it created enough like momentum and pressure to get the rest of the world. Now, of course, like fossil fuels and landmines are very different things. No one is like, I can't get to work without my landmine. But like, you know, however, it's an interesting
Like the
strategy.
opposite, I think, despite
I
the
think
landmine,
so.
right?
Yes. But it's an interesting strategy. And I think we're starting to see that like, okay, that could really bear fruit. Another thing that came up like on the ground there was that there was like kind of an open letter from a bunch of different civil society groups really saying like, hey, it's time to actually organize around addressing this ridiculous consensus thing and like actually changing some of the processes at COP and those kinds of things. And then other people I talked to were saying, you know, yeah, like the negotiations, sure, the like trade show happening beyond them, like nobody needs
Circus.
it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I
Yeah.
think we do need those opportunities, but I don't think it has to be COP. So, for example, I've gone to more New York climate weeks than COPs.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because that's where I feel it's much more a democratic process because it's all sort of crowdsourced. It does need to be a bit more organized, in my opinion, but you know, climate weeks are springing up everywhere. So my home city of Toronto has a climate week now. This is the first year. London Climate Week has been happening for a while. There's all these regional climate weeks. Africa had a big climate week a year or two ago. So that's where the discussions are happening, and they're much more solution focused because they're more regionally focused.
I would just say, I mean, I agree with you, Katharine, but I also would highlight the fact that the climate weeks, the beauty of the climate week, although there is some pay to playness there, which I think is problematic, but the climate weeks are also locally embedded, so that all of a sudden it really is for the mayors, the regional leaders, rather than this like everybody fly. I mean, I have to say the last time I was at a COP, I ended up at an event where there were people from Brookings and people from a whole bunch of other think tanks from here in DC. And I was like, I can't believe I flew across the world to sit in a room so that we could all present to one another. I mean, we could have done this. I mean, we could have done this by all taking the metro. There's no reason to do that. And that kind of the whole, you know, three-ring circus part, I think that has to go. I know some of my colleagues are very upset with my making that statement, but it's just like that could happen at a regional level that is much more valuable for decision making at the scale. And I'm all for that. I mean, obviously, I believe in taking what we have in our scientific information and getting it out there. But I'm not sure that getting it out there, there's nobody from the regime that's going to be like, oh, I was at that panel with all those people from Washington, D.C., and now I'm going to change everything we're doing. It would make a lot more sense for, like, we just started Climate Week D.C., which they unfortunately scheduled it for a really bad time last year, but I'm hoping they'll have it. I think maybe it'll take off. It was right after, Trump made some interesting announcements, so it was really oddly timed. But this kind of a regional effort, I think, can really help to build climate community in ways that could be much more helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I completely agree, because that's where we are today.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need, and the thing is, this COP was billed as the implementation COP. Well, we need implementation at every scale. And in fact, implementing, and ICLEI and the C40 network make this very powerful. They're the city networks. Implementation at the municipal scale is in many ways much easier than at the national or federal scale, because the scale of solutions, the scale of decisions, the speed at which those decisions can be made is much
faster.
faster.
Impacts too, remember, right? People are experiencing the climate crisis in their communities, and it's very varied based on where you're based. So absolutely.
Exactly. And even in the US, where climate change is so polarized, one of my colleagues' research has shown that the closer we get, like the closer we bring impacts to home, like you just said, the less polarized they are. Because we're talking about our shared home and our shared neighborhood or our shared city or town that we all went through the flood together. So it's really like subnational action and engagement and communication, I think, is almost like the secret. I don't want to call it the secret tool. I don't want to call it secret weapon. It's not a weapon.
Secret sauce?
Secret sauce. Yeah, there you go. Secret sauce. That is not really unlocked by a COP, is starting to be organically unlocked by these regional efforts, but more deliberate focus on that, I think, could really catalyze things and move the needle forward faster.
100%. I have one more question, because I know we're running out of time, unless I want to make sure, Amy, you didn't feel like I was cutting you off. No, okay.
No.
So the last question is the big one. So what's your vision for the future? What do you think is possible? What do you hope for? And what do you think is most realistic when we think about both climate policy making, but also where we are in the climate crisis and where we need to go?
Just that.
Katharine,
a little bitty question just to end it.
Oof. Well, I think that what we are seeing now, when I live in Texas, and I'm from Canada, where our carbon price, our target price on carbon just got removed. And we're seeing the impacts. I mean, Texas is actually the most vulnerable state in the U.S. to climate impacts, and Canada has seen the massive wildfires in recent years like we've never seen before. So all of the resistance that we're experiencing, the dismantling of climate science and research and solutions and sharing of information and all that, it reminds me of the line, rage against the dying of the light. Rage against the dying of the fossil fuel powered light. I feel like those who have built their power and wealth on the history of fossil fuels in our society, they understand that their days are numbered. They understand that it is not going to be the fuel source of our society over the next 100 years. And countries like China are already light years ahead of the US in making that clear. And so this is their last ditch fight to put off that tipping point as long as they possibly can, to make sure that the quarterly returns are as high as possible for as long as possible before they take all their gains and go off to their bunkers. And what that really means is we're getting closer to winning, but it is darkest before the dawn, and it is very, very dark right now. I am a hopeful person, but that's because I practice hope like an Olympic sport. I'm not an optimistic person. I expect the worst, and then I can always be pleasantly surprised if it doesn't happen, or grimly validated if it does, which is more the case these days. Lots of grim validation these days. So the arc of justice, as they say, really is bending in the right direction, but man, it is a brutal situation out there right now. And what breaks my heart is that the science says that every bit of additional warming we put in place has an impact, and it will have an impact on the people who've done the least to cause it, that had no say in that decision actually being made. And so that is why doing everything we can to accelerate our social tipping points is so important. And so that's why, full circle back, I spend so much of my time as a scientist doing communication, because the social science says that that is one of the tipping points we need. And I feel like that's the one where I can help the most.
Such an apocalyptically optimistic perspective.
Just for you.
How about that? Woohoo! Okay, so Amy, what have you got?
I would say, well, I think that, to Katharine's point, like I do feel like we're seeing them fight so hard because they know that they only have so much time left, and they're going to try to make as much money off of their assets as they can before they can't anymore. Like, of course that's happening, but it is to a certain degree unstoppable. Like there's so much renewable energy penetration in so many places. Even the IEA, which historically was not super optimistic about renewables, came out with its report, this week saying, yeah, fossil fuel use is going to peak in, I think they said, oh God, I don't want to misquote it. Anyway, the peak is coming soon.
Yeah, the peak is coming. Yeah, they definitely said that, yeah.
And they looked at, how much renewables are growing. And I think actually one thing that was interesting about this COP was the fact that the US not being there was a good thing. It cut back on some of the obstruction that was happening. I think that it probably cleared the path for some of these other countries to get together and say, you know what, now, not only are we going to have this meeting in Colombia in April, but I think it's 29 countries now have said that they are going to veto the COP presidency text unless they put fossil fuel phase out back in. And we're talking the UK, Australia, these, of course, global South countries as well, but some of the bigger fossil fuel countries to boot. So,
Australia
I think
actually committed to that? I didn't realize
yes,
that.
they did. I have a little theory about this, which is that and this is totally because we have an Australia reporter who gives me all the hot goss on Australian politics. But Australia's environment minister was really hoping to get COP hosting. He wanted to kind of preside over the negotiations and be more involved in all of that. And their prime minister didn't turn up to COP, kept telling the press they didn't want it, all of that stuff. And so, yeah, he's like, I kind of wonder if this guy didn't just do this as a little bit of a screw you to his boss back home.
Yeah, I know that, and all the coal industry in Australia. So that's interesting.
But yeah, it's pretty interesting. Netherlands co-hosting a fossil fuel phase-out meeting with Colombia, very interesting. I think there are starting to be countries that are getting on board with this idea. The other thing that I feel especially in the US, we're not looking at all, is how big of a deal it would be if the UK were to actually follow through on phasing out North Sea oil, because they would be the first developed fossil fuel based economy to get off of fossil fuels. People always say, what about Norway? Norway's suckling at the teat of the fossil fuel funding trough.
I was just at the Petrobanda festival. I know. Yeah, I know all about it.
They're still, very dependent on that wealth fund, and in a way that the UA would not be, which is why I think, again, you're seeing the fossil fuel. They're spending so much money trying to take down renewables in the UK right now. They're even putting, I have a couple of reporters there that are they're putting up fake candidates in little community elections that they know won't win, just to get
anti-renewables
talking points out there.
They're taking a page out of the playbook over here is what they're doing, right? I mean,
I know.
Or
So
wind
anyway,
power. Yeah.
I'm watching that as a potentially quite because to me, I actually feel as effective as the science denial was, the economic argument against action, I think, has been much more entrenched and more successful in a way, and is much harder to push back on. So for a very developed, very fossil fuel tied country to decouple from fossil fuels as their economic engine would be a huge, huge moment. And we could see it in the not so distant future. So
that's hopeful.
Hoping. Yeah,
that's
there you go.
Very hopeful. Very well. I feel like we should wrap up on that to just say, I think it's very likely that the worst is still in front of us as the death knell continues for the fossil fuel interest. But I think that there are these amazing glimmers of hope and opportunities for us all to do more, and to do it in a strategic way that hopefully pushes back against some of this, including the misinformation. So I applaud all of your efforts and all the work you both are doing with your climate communication, because it's even more important now than I think it was, 5-10 years ago. And thank you so much for coming on the COPOut podcast. And I look forward to continuing our conversation in the future.
Likewise.
Maybe in Colombia.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be fun.
I'm gonna go. I'm nearby, so it's easy. I'm like, ooh,
And
Colombia?
she's like looking out the window. I'm
Perfect.
looking at Colombia right now.
I can see it from my window. No, not really,
Awesome.
but close.